They say every house has a story, but 1847 Maple Street had a curse. Or so the entire town believed. For 3 decades it stood there like a wounded soldier, watching families drive past, children point from car windows, and real estate agents shake their heads in defeat. 30 years. 30 years of for sale signs that faded in the sun. 30 years of price drops that made no difference. 30 years of silence behind those boarded windows. But what if I told you that the reason nobody would buy this house had nothing to do with ghosts or bad luck? What if the truth was far more heartbreaking and beautiful than anyone could have imagined? What if one person's greatest act of love became an entire community's deepest shame? Stay with me, because what happened when someone finally bought that house will restore your faith in the power of human connection and the secrets we keep to protect the ones we love. The weight of windows. The morning Thomas Chen pulled up to 1847 Maple Street. The autumn sun was doing its best to make the house look welcoming. It failed. The Victorian-style home sagged like an old man who'd given up on standing straight, its once white paint peeling in long, sad strips that curled toward the overgrown lawn. The windows, those infamous windows, were boarded up with wood so weathered it had turned silver gray, giving the house the appearance of a blind giant. Thomas sat in his car for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and wondered what the hell he was doing. At 42 years old, he'd lost his wife to cancer, his job to corporate downsizing, and his sense of purpose to the relentless grind of grief. The house before him seemed like a fitting metaphor for his life, broken, unwanted, and stuck in time. "You're really going through with this?" The voice came from his phone, which he'd propped on the dashboard. His sister Maya's face filled the screen, her expression caught between concern and exasperation. "The price is right," Thomas said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Maya, it's $60,000 for a 4-bedroom Victorian in a decent neighborhood. Do you know what that would cost anywhere else?" "There's a reason it's $60,000, Tommy. That house has been on the market since before you were born. Before I was born. Mom used to tell us stories about it when we were kids, scared us half to death." Thomas finally opened the car door, the hinges creaking in harmony with the house's general state of decay. Those were just stories. Ghost tales to keep kids from breaking in. Were they? Maya leaned closer to her camera. "Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store told me that house has been listed since 1994. 30 years, Tommy. The price has dropped from $300,000 to $60,000. Doesn't that terrify you even a little bit?" It did, actually, but Thomas had learned that when you've already lived through your worst nightmare, watching the person you love most waste away in a hospital bed, holding her hand as she took her last breath, architectural mysteries lose their power to frighten you. "I'll call you later," he said, ending the video chat before Maya could mount another argument. The walkway to the front door was cracked, with weeds pushing through like nature's slow-motion rebellion. Thomas had been given the keys by Janet Morrison, the real estate agent who'd looked simultaneously thrilled and guilty when he'd signed the papers. She'd tried one last time to talk him out of it, mentioning the history and the atmosphere and community concerns, but Thomas had simply asked if the foundation was sound and the roof was intact. When she'd reluctantly confirmed both, he'd signed his name on the dotted line. Now, standing before the front door, a heavy oak thing with an ornate knocker shaped like a lion's head, Thomas felt the weight of that decision. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, and the door swung open with a horror movie creak that would have been funny if it weren't so perfectly on brand. The interior was dark, the boarded windows allowing only thin strands of light to penetrate the gloom. Thomas pulled out his flashlight and swept it across the entryway. Dust motes danced in the beam like tiny galaxies, undisturbed for what must have been years. The floor was hardwood, scuffed and dull but appearing structurally sound. A staircase curved upward to his left, its banister carved with an intricate pattern of leaves and vines. "Hello?" Thomas called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. He felt foolish immediately. Who was he expecting to answer? But there was something about the house that demanded acknowledgement, as if ignoring its presence would be rude. He spent the next hour exploring, his flashlight revealing room after room frozen in time. The furniture was still here, all of it. A living room with a faded floral couch and matching armchairs arranged around a brick fireplace. A dining room with a table set for 6, the plates covered in dust, but the arrangement suggesting that someone had expected guests who never arrived. A kitchen with avocado green appliances that screamed 1970s. The counters still holding a vintage coffee maker and a ceramic cookie jar shaped like a cat. It was upstairs that Thomas found the first photograph. It was in what appeared to be the master bedroom, sitting on a dresser in a tarnished silver frame. Thomas wiped the glass with his sleeve, and two faces emerged from beneath the grime. A young woman with kind eyes and dark hair pulled back in a bun, standing beside a tall, thin man with gentle features and a shy smile. They were dressed in clothing that looked to be from the 1950s or early 1960s, standing in front of this very house when it was still proud and white and whole. Thomas turned the frame over. On the back, in faded blue ink, someone had written, "Margaret and William, 1962, our forever home." A chill ran down Thomas's spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. He set the photograph down carefully and continued his exploration, but now he was looking for more pieces of Margaret and William's story. He found them everywhere. A wedding album in the closet, the white dress preserved in yellowing plastic, a collection of vinyl records in the living room, Glenn Miller, Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, a sewing basket beside a chair near the window, with a half-finished piece of embroidery still stretched on its hoop, a house surrounded by roses, the thread still bright despite the decades. But it was in the smallest bedroom, clearly a child's room with wallpaper patterned with cowboys and horses, that Thomas found something that made his chest tighten. The room was pristine, untouched by the decay that had claimed the rest of the house. A small bed was made with military precision, the blue bedspread smooth and waiting. Toys lined the shelves, a wooden train set, a collection of toy soldiers, a teddy bear with button eyes that seemed to watch Thomas as he entered. On the small desk beneath the boarded window sat a row of picture books and a framed photograph of a boy maybe 7 or 8 years old, with Margaret's kind eyes and William's shy smile. He was sitting on the front steps of the house, holding the same teddy bear, his expression caught in that unself-conscious joy that only children can manage. Thomas picked up the photograph, and that's when he noticed the date stamped on the corner, July 1968. His hands were shaking slightly as he set it down. There was a story here, a sad one clearly, but Thomas couldn't yet piece it together. Why had this family's belongings been left untouched? Why had nobody bought this house in 30 years? He was about to head back downstairs when he heard it, a knock at the front door. Thomas made his way down the staircase, his footsteps echoing in silence. When he opened the door, he found an elderly woman standing on the porch, leaning on a cane, her white hair caught up in a neat bun. She must have been in her 80s, with a face mapped by decades of smiles and sorrows. "You bought it," she said. It wasn't a question. Her eyes, sharp and blue despite her age, studied Thomas with an intensity that made him want to stand up straighter. "I did," Thomas confirmed. "I'm Thomas Chen. I just moved to town." "I know who you are," the woman said. "Small town. Word travels. I'm Eleanor Hartley. I live 3 houses down, the yellow one with the garden." "Nice to meet you," Thomas said, though Eleanor's expression suggested this wasn't a social call. "I came to tell you about them," Eleanor said, nodding toward the interior of the house. "About Margaret and William and little Daniel. Because if you're going to live here, you should know why nobody else would. You should know what this town did." Thomas stepped aside, gesturing for Eleanor to come in, but she shook her head firmly. "I won't set foot in that house. Haven't since 1969. None of us have. That's part of the problem, you see." She adjusted her grip on her cane. "Do you have time for a story, Mr. Chen? A true one, though you might wish it weren't." Thomas nodded, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door behind him. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, a stark contrast to the coolness that seemed to emanate from the house itself. Eleanor settled herself on the porch steps with a soft groan, and Thomas sat beside her. For a long moment, she was quiet, her gaze fixed on the overgrown garden where roses had once bloomed, but now only their wild décès. And dance remained, tangled and thorny. "Margaret Hartley was my cousin," Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the emotion Thomas could see gathering in her eyes. "Second cousin, actually. But we were close." She married William Brennan in 1962. He was a school teacher, kind as they come. They bought this house with their savings, and it was beautiful then, a showpiece. Margaret had a gift for making things lovely. Eleanor paused, pulling a handkerchief from her pocket and dabbing at her eyes, though no tears had fallen yet. They tried for years to have a baby, years of hoping and disappointment. Then, in 1960, miracle of miracles, Daniel came along. That boy was the light of their lives. "You've seen his room, I imagine?" Thomas nodded. Margaret kept it perfect. She loved that boy with a fierceness that was almost frightening. William did too, in his quieter way. Daniel was bright, curious, always asking questions. He wanted to be a scientist, had all these books about stars and planets. Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. He was 8 years old when it happened. Thomas felt his stomach drop, sensing what was coming. August 1968. Daniel was riding his bicycle in the street, right out there. Eleanor pointed with a trembling finger. A car came around the corner too fast. The driver was drunk, middle of the afternoon. Daniel never had a chance. "God," Thomas whispered. The driver was Scott Morrison. Yes, the same Morrison family. Janet Morrison, who sold you this house, is his daughter-in-law. Scott was the mayor's son. Rich family, connections everywhere. The police investigation was a joke. They called it an accident, said Daniel had swerved into the road unexpectedly. Steadily. Scott Morrison paid a fine, just a fine, can you imagine? And that was it. No jail time, no real consequences. Eleanor's hands were gripping her cane so tightly her knuckles had gone white. This town protected him, protected one of their own, while Margaret and William buried their only child. The Brennans tried to press charges, tried to get justice, but every door was slammed in their faces. The newspaper barely covered it. People stopped talking about it. Within a month, it was like Daniel had never existed, for everyone except his parents. Thomas felt sick. The pristine bedroom upstairs, the untouched toys, the photograph of a smiling boy. It all took on a new, devastating significance. Margaret couldn't accept it, Eleanor continued. Couldn't accept that her boy was gone, and that the man who killed him was walking free, living his life, laughing with friends at the country club. She and William became obsessed with keeping Daniel's memory alive. They kept his room exactly as it was. They set a place for him at dinner every night. They celebrated his birthday every year, baking a cake, singing to an empty chair. What happened to them? Thomas asked, though part of him didn't want to know. William died in 1975. Heart attack. The doctor said it was a weak valve, but I think it was a broken heart. After he was gone, Margaret became even more isolated. She rarely left the house. She talked to Daniel like he was still there, still alive. I visited her when I could, but it was painful. She was trapped in 1968, in the moment before that car came around the corner, trying to live in a world where her boy was still alive. Eleanor finally let the tears fall, and Thomas found his own eyes burning. Margaret died in 1994. I found her. She'd had a stroke, been gone for a few days before I thought to check on her. She was 72 years old, and she'd spent the last 26 years of her life alone in this house, talking to ghosts. Eleanor wiped her eyes roughly. Her will was specific. The house was to be sold, and the money was to go to organizations that fight drunk driving and support parents who've lost children. But she had one condition, one strange, heartbreaking condition. Thomas waited, his heart pounding. The house had to be sold exactly as it was. Nothing could be removed. Nothing could be changed. The buyers had to agree to live with Daniel's room intact, with all of the family's belongings still in place. Margaret needed for Daniel's memory to continue, for the evidence of his existence to remain. She couldn't bear the thought of his things being thrown away, forgotten like he'd been forgotten by this town. That's why nobody would buy it, Thomas said, understanding dawning. That's part of it, Eleanor agreed. The legal requirements scared people off. Who wants to buy a house they can't truly make their own? But there's more. This town, we're all guilty, Mr. Chen. Every one of us who stayed silent, who looked the way when the Brennans needed support, who let Scott Morrison walk around like he hadn't destroyed a family. We couldn't face what we'd done, what we'd allowed to happen. Buying this house would mean confronting that guilt, and we're all too cowardly." Eleanor turned to look at Thomas directly. "For 30 years, this house has stood here as a monument to our collective shame. Every time someone drives past, they remember. Every time the for sale sign fades and gets replaced, they remember. We've let this house rot rather than face what it represents." Thomas sat in stunned silence, processing everything Eleanor had told him. The house behind him suddenly felt different, not haunted by ghosts, but by the weight of injustice and grief. "Why are you telling me this?" he finally asked. Eleanor smiled sadly. "Because you're not from here. You don't carry our guilt, our history. Because when Janet Morrison told me someone had finally bought the house, someone from out of town who didn't know the story, I felt something I haven't felt in decades, hope. Maybe you can do what we couldn't. Maybe you can honor Margaret's wish without being crushed by the weight of what happened here." She stood slowly, leaning heavily on her cane. "Or maybe I'm a foolish old woman who wants to believe that some good can come from all this sorrow. Either way, you deserve to know the truth." Thomas stood as well, his mind reeling. What happened to Scott Morrison? Lived a long, happy life. Died 5 years ago, surrounded by family, having never publicly acknowledged what he'd done. His obituary in the local paper praised him as a pillar of the community. Eleanor's voice was bitter. "That's the world we live in, Mr. Chen." She made her way down the porch steps, then paused and looked back. "Daniel's birthday is November 15th. Margaret always made chocolate cake, his favorite. I don't know if you're a cake-baking type of person, but, well, it might be a nice thing to do, to acknowledge that he was here, that he mattered." As Eleanor walked away, Thomas stood on the porch of his new home, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. The house behind him was no longer just a structure of wood and nails. It was a testament to love and loss, to injustice and memory, to the ways we fail each other and the prices we pay for that failure. He thought of his wife Sarah, of the year he'd spent keeping her office exactly as she'd left it, unable to box up her books or donate her clothes. He thought of how people had gently suggested he move on, as if love could be packed away like winter clothes. He understood Margaret Brennan in a way he suspected few people in this town could. Thomas pulled out his phone and called Maya. "Changed your mind?" She answered hopefully. "No," Thomas said, "but I need to tell you a story, and then I need your help with something." The light returns. The first thing Thomas did was remove the boards from the windows. He started early on a Saturday morning, having borrowed a crowbar from Eleanor, who'd watched from her garden with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read, part approval, part anxiety, as if she wasn't sure whether he was doing the right thing or desecrating something sacred. The boards came off one by one, revealing glass that was surprisingly intact despite decades of neglect. As each window was freed, light poured into the house like water breaching a dam. The transformation was immediate and profound. Dust that had seemed romantic in the dim glow of a flashlight now showed itself for what it was, years of neglect that needed addressing, but the light also revealed the bones of what had once been a beautiful home, intricate crown molding, hardwood floors with a lovely grain, built-in bookshelves with carved details. Maya arrived around noon with her husband James and their 2 teenage kids, Emma and Sam. They'd driven 3 hours from the city, and Maya had spent most of the car ride trying to prepare them for what they might find. "Uncle Tommy!" Emma called out, picking her way through the overgrown front yard. At 16, she'd inherited her mother's practical nature and her uncle's tendency toward emotional intensity. "This place is actually kind of amazing, in a creepy, frozen-in-time sort of way." Sam, 14 and more reserved, hung back, his eyes taking in every detail. "It's like a museum," he said quietly. "Like one of those historical houses they preserve exactly as they were." "That's more accurate than you know," Thomas said, and he told them the story Eleanor had shared, watching their expressions shift from curiosity to sorrow to anger as he spoke. "That's so messed up," Emma said when he finished, her voice shaking. "They just let that guy get away with it? And then everyone in town was too chicken to do anything about it?" "Not everyone," Thomas corrected gently. Eleanor tried. "I'm sure others did too. But small-town politics, family connections, the desire to avoid uncomfortable truths, it all combined to create a perfect storm of injustice." Maya had been quiet throughout his story, but now she moved closer to Thomas, taking his hand. "So what are you going to do?" "I'm going to honor Margaret's wishes," Thomas said. "But I'm going to do more than that. I'm going to make this house live again. Not as a shrine to the past, but as a place that acknowledges what happened while also looking toward the future." Over the next few weeks, Thomas threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even him. He cleaned every room, every surface, treating Daniel's belongings with the reverence they deserved, but also bringing fresh air and care to spaces that had languished in darkness for so long. He hired a local contractor, a young woman named Sam Chen, no relation, though they joked about, who'd recently moved to town and didn't carry the same historical baggage as the longtime residents. "I heard about this place," Sam told him on her first day. "The house nobody would buy. But I also heard about why, and honestly, what that family went through, what this town did. You're doing a good thing here, keeping the memory alive while also not letting the house die completely." They worked on the essentials first, updating the electrical system, replacing old pipes, fixing the roof where it had started to leak. Thomas was careful to maintain the character of the house while making it safe and functional. The avocado green appliances in the kitchen were replaced with modern equivalents, but he kept the vintage coffee maker, having it restored by a specialist in the city. Daniel's room remained untouched, exactly as Margaret had wanted, but Thomas made sure it was clean, the toys dusted, the books carefully preserved. He had the wallpaper professionally cleaned and the teddy bear gently restored by a conservator who specialized in vintage toys. "This feels important," the conservator, an elderly man named Arthur, had said when he delivered the bear back. "Like we're preserving a life, not just an object." Word spread through the town about what Thomas was doing. The reactions were mixed. Some people, mostly Eleanor's generation, stopped by to offer support, sharing their memories of Daniel and the Brennans. Others drove past slowly, staring, but never stopped. Janet Morrison came once, ostensibly to check on the property, but really, Thomas suspected, to see if he was going to cause trouble for her family's legacy. "You're keeping the room?" she'd asked, her tone carefully neutral. "I am," Thomas had confirmed, "and I'm doing more than that." That more had started as a small idea but had grown into something larger. Thomas had found among Margaret's papers years of correspondence, letters she'd written to lawmakers about drunk driving laws, donations she'd made to victim support organizations, even a journal where she'd documented every interaction with law enforcement and local officials in the aftermath of Daniel's death. Thomas digitized everything and created a website, Daniel's Story, a call for justice and remembrance. He didn't sensationalize or seek revenge. He simply laid out the facts, what had happened to Daniel Brennan, how the system had failed his family, and what Margaret and William had done to try to make meaning from their tragedy. The website included photographs of Daniel, the smiling boy on the porch, school pictures, images of him with his parents, alongside Margaret's advocacy work and information about the organizations she'd supported. Thomas also included a section on the current state of drunk driving laws and victims' rights, showing how much had changed since 1968, but also how much work remained. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Local news picked up the story first, then regional outlets, then national ones. Suddenly, people who'd driven past 1847 Maple Street for decades without a second thought were confronting the truth of what had happened there. The town's historical society reached out, asking if they could include Daniel's story in their archives. Victims' advocacy groups across the country shared the website, praising Margaret's early efforts and highlighting the importance of remembering victims like Daniel. But it was the letters that moved Thomas the most. They came by email, by post, sometimes hand-delivered to his door, parents who'd lost children to drunk drivers, thanking him for honoring Daniel's memory. Survivors of accidents, grateful that someone was still fighting for accountability. Teachers who wanted to use Daniel's story in their classes as a lesson about justice and civic responsibility. And then, 3 months after Thomas had moved in, he received a letter that changed everything. It was handwritten, the script shaky but legible, and it began, "Mr. Chen, my name is Robert Morrison. Scott Morrison was my father." Thomas's hands trembled as he read, "I was 12 when Daniel Brennan died. I remembered the day, not because I understood what had happened, but because it was the day my father started drinking even more than usual. For years, I didn't know the full story. Dad never talked about it, and in our family, you didn't ask uncomfortable questions. It wasn't until I was in college, researching a paper on restorative justice, that I stumbled across old newspaper articles about the accident. Even then, it took years for me to piece together the truth. My father had killed a child and faced no real consequences. He'd lived his entire life free and comfortable, while the Brennans suffered. I confronted him once, about 10 years before he died. He was already sick, his liver failing from decades of alcohol abuse. He told me it was an accident, that he'd paid his debt. But I saw in his eyes that he knew, he'd always known, that what he'd paid was nothing compared to what the Brennans had lost. I've lived with this guilt my entire adult life. I didn't kill Daniel Brennan, but I benefited from a system that protected my father while destroying his family. I've donated to victims' organizations in Daniel's name, volunteered with DUI prevention programs, but it never felt like enough. How could it be? Your website, Mr. Chen, has brought this all back to the surface. The town is talking about it, finally, truly talking about it. People are angry, ashamed, grappling with what was allowed to happen. It's painful, but it's necessary. I know this is a lot to ask, but I'd like to meet with you. I'd like to see Daniel's room if you'll allow it. I'd like to pay my respects to a boy I never knew but whose death has shaped my entire life, and if you think it's appropriate, I'd like to make a public apology on behalf of my family, not because it will change anything, but because it's the right thing to do, and should have been done 56 years ago. Whatever you decide, thank you for what you're doing. You've given Daniel Brennan something he never had, a voice that can't be silenced. Sincerely, Robert Morrison. Thomas read the letter 3 times, then called Eleanor. He wants to apologize, Thomas said without preamble when she answered. Scott Morrison's son, Eleanor said immediately, understanding. I heard he still lives. In town, on the other side. Never knew him personally. Should I meet with him? There was a long pause. That's not my decision to make, Thomas, but yes, I think you should. I think Margaret would want you to. She wasn't a hateful person. She just wanted acknowledgement, wanted people to see what had been done and say it was wrong. This might be the closest she ever gets to that. Thomas met Robert Morrison on a Tuesday afternoon in November, exactly 1 week before what would have been Daniel's 64th birthday. Robert was in his late 60s, with gray hair and eyes that carried the weight of inherited guilt. He stood in the doorway, clearly nervous, until Thomas invited him in. They sat in the living room, the one with the faded floral couch that Thomas had had professionally cleaned and restored. For a long moment, neither spoke. I was afraid you wouldn't agree to see me, Robert finally said. I almost didn't, Thomas admitted. But then I thought about Margaret, about how she'd spent decades trying to be heard, trying to make people acknowledge what happened. Turning you away felt like continuing that silence. Robert nodded, his eyes traveling around the room, taking in the careful preservation of the Brennans' life. Janet told me you'd kept everything. She thought you were crazy, but I understand it. This is all that's left of them, isn't it? All that proves they were here, that they loved, that they mattered. Would you like to see his room? Thomas asked. The walk upstairs felt ceremonial, weighty. Thomas opened the door to Daniel's room and stepped aside, letting Robert enter first. Robert stood in the doorway for a full minute, not speaking. Barely breathing. Then he moved to the desk, looking at the photograph of Daniel on the porch steps. He looks happy, Robert whispered. He looks like a kid who thought the world was a good place, that he was safe. His voice broke. I'm so sorry. I know I wasn't, but I'm so sorry anyway. Thomas left him there for a while, giving him privacy to grieve for a boy who'd died before Robert was old enough to understand what his father had done. When Robert came back downstairs, his eyes were red, but his expression was determined. I'd like to organize a memorial, a proper one. I have some money saved, and I'd like to create a scholarship in Daniel's name at the elementary school where he would have studied. I'd like to work with the town council to install a bench in the park with a plaque remembering him. And I'd like to make a public statement, acknowledging what my father did and apologizing on behalf of my family. You don't have to, Thomas started, but Robert cut him off. I do, though. Maybe not legally, but morally. This town let my father off the hook, and in doing so, they taught me that some people matter more than others, that connections and money can buy you out of accountability. It's taken me a lifetime to unlearn that. Let me do this, please. The memorial was held on November 15th, Daniel's birthday. Thomas had been worried that no one would come, but as the afternoon progressed, cars began lining the street. Eleanor arrived first, of course, walking slowly with her cane, but with her head held high. Then came others, former students of William Brennan, people who'd known the family, younger residents who'd only heard the stories but wanted to show support. Robert Morrison stood at a podium that had been set up in the front yard of 1847 Maple Street, his voice amplified by a small sound system. Behind him, Thomas had hung a banner with Daniel's photograph, the one from the porch steps, alongside the words "Remembered and Honored, Daniel William Brennan, 1960 to 1968.
My name is Robert Morrison,
He began, his voice strong despite the trembling of his hands. And I'm here to do something that should have been done 56 years ago. My father, Scott Morrison, was responsible for the death of Daniel Brennan. He was driving drunk in the middle of the day. He hit an 8-year-old boy who was riding his bicycle, and then he used his family's money and influence to avoid real consequences for what he'd done. I was a child when it happened. I didn't understand then what I understand now, that my father's freedom came at the cost of this family's peace, that every day he walked free was another day Margaret and William Brennan lived with unbearable grief and no justice. This town protected my father. This town chose to look away rather than face an uncomfortable truth. And in doing so, this town failed the Brennans completely. We failed Daniel. We failed his parents. We failed our own moral responsibility to each other. I cannot undo what was done. I cannot bring Daniel back or give the Brennans the justice they deserved. But I can stand here today and say clearly, publicly, and without reservation, what happened was wrong. My father was wrong. This town was wrong. And Margaret and William Brennan deserved so much better than what they received. To Daniel's memory, I offer this apology. To anyone who's ever been failed by a system that protects the powerful at the expense of victims, I offer my commitment to do better. And to this community, I offer a challenge. Let this house, let Daniel's story remind us of the kind of town we want to be. One that stands up for justice even when it's uncomfortable, even when it implicates people we know and love. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Thomas saw Janet Morrison standing at the back, tears streaming down her face. He saw elderly residents who'd been adults in 1968, their faces etched with shame and sorrow. He saw younger people, some holding their own children, understanding perhaps for the first time the real cost of silence and complicity. Eleanor spoke next, sharing memories of Margaret and William, of their love for Daniel and their tireless advocacy after his death. Then Thomas stepped forward. I didn't know the Brennans, he said. I didn't know Daniel. But in the months I've lived in this house, I've come to understand them. I've read Margaret's letters, seen the care she put into preserving her son's memory, witnessed the love that saturated every corner of this home. Margaret Brennan spent the last 26 years of her life alone, talking to a child who was gone, keeping his room ready for a return that would never come. That level of grief, that depth of love, it would have broken most people completely. But Margaret turned her sorrow into action. She advocated for stronger drunk driving laws. She supported other grieving parents. She made sure that even if Daniel couldn't live, his death would mean something. This house has stood empty for 30 years because we, as a community, as a society, often choose comfort over confronting hard truths. But I believe Margaret would want this house to be more than a monument to the past. She'd want it to be a reminder that every life matters, that justice isn't optional, and that we have a responsibility to each other that transcends politics and social status and family connections. So this house will remain as Margaret wished, with Daniel's room preserved, with the evidence of their family's love intact. But it will also live again. It will be a home, filled with light and life. Because the best way to honor Daniel isn't to let everything stop in 1968. It's to carry forward the love his parents had for him, the determination Margaret showed in fighting for change, and the simple truth that he was here, He mattered, and he deserves to be remembered. The scholarship fund was established the following week, with Robert Morrison making the first substantial donation and others in the community contributing as well. The bench was installed in Memorial Park in the spring, with a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Daniel William Brennan, 1960 to 1968, may we always choose justice, courage, and compassion." But perhaps the most meaningful change came from an unexpected source. The town council, spurred by the renewed attention to Daniel's story and pressure from younger residents, voted to commission a formal historical review of the 1968 case. While they couldn't change the past or prosecute a dead man, they could officially acknowledge what had happened and commit to ensuring such failures of justice wouldn't be repeated. Thomas continued working on the house throughout the winter. Maya and her family visited often with MMA and Sam, developing a particular attachment to the place. Emma started a podcast about Daniel's story and the broader issues of justice and accountability, which became popular in their school and beyond. Sam, quieter but no less affected, began volunteering with a local organization that supported families affected by drunk driving accidents. "You've started something," Maya told Thomas one evening as they sat in the restored living room, a fire crackling in the hearth that hadn't been used in decades. "Something bigger than just fixing up a house." Thomas looked around at the space that had transformed from a dark, forgotten place into a warm home. Margaret's embroidery hung on the wall, framed and preserved, the house surrounded by roses, just as she'd envisioned it. William's books lined the shelves, ready to be read again, and upstairs, Daniel's room remained untouched but no longer abandoned, regularly dusted and cared for, a testament to a life cut short but never truly ended. "I think Margaret started it," Thomas said. "She just needed someone to finish it." On a warm day in June, Thomas hosted the first annual Daniel Brennan Memorial Garden Party. The overgrown yard had been transformed, not into the manicured perfection of a magazine spread, but into a welcoming, slightly wild space where roses bloomed in abundance, having been carefully cultivated from the descendants of the bushes Margaret had once tended. Eleanor sat in a place of honor on the front porch, surrounded by people who'd come to pay their respects and celebrate the changes that had swept through the town in the wake of Daniel's story being told. There were families with Aungie children, teenagers who'd learned about Daniel in school, older residents who'd carried guilt for decades and were finally able to speak about it. Robert Morrison was there too, along with Janet and other members of the Morrison family who'd chosen to face their history rather than run from it. It was uncomfortable at times. There were conversations that started awkward and painful, but it was real and it was necessary. Thomas stood on the same porch steps where Daniel had sat for his photograph 58 years earlier, and he raised a glass of lemonade, Daniel's favorite drink according to Eleanor's memories. "To Daniel," he said simply, "who lived 8 years but whose impact will last lifetimes. To Margaret and William, who loved fiercely and fought tirelessly, and to all of us who have the power to choose justice and compassion over silence and complicity." "To Daniel," the crowd echoed. As the party continued, Thomas slipped away for a moment, climbing the stairs to Daniel's room. He'd developed a habit of visiting it daily, spending a few minutes in quiet reflection. He wasn't religious, but it felt like a form of prayer, acknowledging that this child had existed, had mattered, had been loved. Today, though, the room felt different. Perhaps it was the sound of laughter floating up from the garden, or the way the afternoon light streamed through the window, or simply the knowledge that Daniel's story was finally being honored in the way Margaret had always hoped. Thomas picked up the teddy bear from the bed, carefully restored and returned to its place, and he spoke aloud to the child whose presence still filled this space. "They haven't forgotten you, Daniel. They won't forget you, I promise." And in that moment, in that room that had been frozen in grief for so long, Thomas felt something shift. Not dramatically, there was no sudden breeze or mysterious sign, just a subtle sense of rightness, of a story finally being told, of justice delayed but not entirely denied, of love that transcended death and time and the failures of the living. He set the bear down gently and went back downstairs to join the celebration, leaving the door to Daniel's room open for the first time in decades, letting the light and the sound of life flow in. carrying forward the memory of a boy who died too young but who, through the love of his parents and the determination of strangers turned advocates, would never truly be forgotten. The house at 1847 Maple Street stood as it always had, but it was no longer a monument to abandonment and shame. It was a home again, filled with light, purpose, and the kind of hope that comes from finally doing the right thing, even when it takes 30 years to get there. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the roses bloomed especially bright and the air carried the sound of children playing in the neighborhood, Thomas would swear he could feel it, a sense of peace, of gratitude, of love that had survived everything the world could throw at it. The house nobody would buy for 30 years had finally found its purpose, not as a shrine to the past, but as a bridge between what was and what could be, a reminder that it's never too late to choose justice, never too late to honor a life, and never too late to transform grief into something that might, just might, make the world a little bit better. Sometimes the most powerful act of love is refusing to let someone be forgotten. Margaret Brennan spent decades making sure her son's life and death meant something. She turned her grief into advocacy, her silence into action, and her loss into a legacy that continues to inspire change. This story reminds us that justice delayed is still worth fighting for, that small acts of courage can ripple across generations, and that homes, like hearts, can be restored, renewed, and filled with light again, even after the darkest of times. May we all have the courage to confront uncomfortable truths, the strength to stand up for those who've been silenced, and the love to ensure that no one is ever truly forgotten.